Hey, Econ 1B folks. Today I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a head start or a hint on how to do problem number 2, the Red Sox White Sox problem on homework 1. So let's get to it. Okay, so here we've got the homework problem number 2, Red Sox and White Sox. So we start out with two places, Boston and Chicago. And they both make two kinds of socks. They both make Red Sox and White Sox. And one of the tricky things about this problem is that we get that information in terms of how many pairs of socks they make in an hour, not how long it takes them to make each pair of socks. So we can go about this two different ways. I'm going to go ahead and write the problem as written. You can also think about going through and saying, okay, well, so for example, Boston can make three pairs of Red Sox in an hour and 6 pairs of White Sox in an hour. You can also think of that in the sort of opposite, right? So if Boston can make 3 pairs of Red Sox in an hour, that means each pair of Red Sox costs 1/3 of an hour. So that's another way of looking at it that might make it a little bit more straightforward mathematically. We also have Chicago can make 5 pairs of Red Sox in an hour and 4 pairs of White Sox. Oops. Per hour. All right. So the first part of the question asks, what is the opportunity cost of White Sox in Boston and in Chicago? So we can do this one of two ways, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the answer key, but we can think about it intuitively, or you can think about it mathematically. So intuitively, we can think, okay, in the time it takes Boston to make 6 pairs of White Sox, they could have made 3 pairs of Red Sox. So in that hour that Boston could have been making White Sox, they could have made 6 pair. So it takes them 1/6 of an hour to make those White Sox. That means that they wouldn't have gotten through making a first pair of Red Sox yet. They would have only made half a pair of Red Sox. So the opportunity cost, let's do it this way. Of making a pair of White Sox in Boston is going to be 1/2 a pair of Red Sox. Does that make sense? So if it takes them 1/6 of an hour to make a pair of White Sox and 1/3 of an hour to make a pair of Red Sox, in the time it takes them to make White Sox, they can't make Red Sox. They can only make half a pair of Red Sox. So in 1/6 of an hour, they couldn't complete a pair of Red Sox because those take 1/3 of an hour. And we can remember that the inverse is true, that for our opportunity cost, or we can think about, okay, in the hour time it takes to make a pair of Red Sox in Boston, in the hour it takes to make Red Sox in Boston, they could make 3 pairs of Red Sox. If they wanted to make White Sox instead, in that 1/3 of an hour, they could make twice as many White Sox as Red Sox. So the opportunity cost of Red Sox is going to be 2 pair White Sox. We can also do this mathematically, and we'll look at Chicago for this example. So for Chicago, we want to think about, okay, we can do it 2 different ways. You can look at the time it takes to make a pair of socks. You can say, okay, the opportunity cost of White Sox in Chicago. White Sox in Chicago, we can think about it again intuitively or mathematically. So in an hour, Chicago can make 4 pairs of White Sox or 5 pairs of Red Sox. So it's close, but they're a little bit better at making Red Sox than White Sox. So in the time it takes them to make White Sox, that's a quarter hour, they could make a pair of Red Sox and a little bit more. Or we could say it takes them a fifth of an hour to make Red Sox and a quarter of an hour to make White Sox. So we can go ahead and put that into our formula and say, okay, well, the opportunity cost of White Sox in Chicago is equal to the cost associated with making White Sox divided by the cost associated with making Red Sox, which gives us 1/4 divided by 1/5, or 0.25 divided by 0.2, 1.25, or 5/4 of a pair of Red Sox. So either way you want to write that, that's the opportunity cost of White Sox. It's a pair of Red Sox and a quarter of a pair of Red Sox. And we could also do the same thing to get the same answer for Red Sox. The opportunity cost of Red Sox is going to be in terms of White Sox. In a fifth of an hour, they can make a pair of Red Sox. They'll give up almost a whole pair of White Sox, but not quite, right? Because they can make Red Sox faster. So it's going to be 4/5 of a pair of White Sox. And then you should be able to really easily from this point go ahead and find the comparative advantage and absolute advantage in producing White Sox and Red Sox for Chicago and for Boston, right? Remember, comparative advantage is the lowest absolute cost. So who can make the most Red Sox in an hour versus who can make the most White Sox in an hour. The comparative advantage is going to come from the lowest opportunity cost. So who gives up the least amount of other thing when they're making it? So who gives up the least amount of Red Sox when making White Sox? That's who has the comparative advantage in White Sox. It's a little confusing, but just try to take it down really simple, write it out, get a scratch paper if that helps, and that'll help you get through it. All right, hit me up in the discussion if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you in class. Thank you.